Hello and welcome back to the CCENT journey with me, Ryan. In this next section, we're going to continue with our understanding of the DTP, the Dynamic Trunking Protocol, but we're going to do some practical demonstrations in this video. So it's very important that you've watched the previous video before continuing with this one. And then we're going to move on to some other topics like CDP, the Cisco Discovery Protocol, and LLDP, the Link Layer Discovery Protocol. For those who don't know, you can contact me here on YouTube, on LinkedIn, or Twitter. So DTP, the Dynamic Trunking Protocol, we said it was the protocol that two switches use on every switch port by default to negotiate with the remote device. Whether that device is another Cisco switch, which hopefully it is because DTP is actually Cisco Proprietary, or if it's another device or another switch from another vendor, like maybe even a PC or server. And when those DTP messages are sent out and there's no response, the switch port will act accordingly. Well, in this particular video, to begin with at least, I've put together 3 examples and we're going to go through them practically on the switches, and then we're going to use our verification command to look at the output. So to begin with, we're going to have a look at how it's set up by default, and then we're going to configure one side is the actual static trunk and the other side is dynamic auto, and we'll see how that behaves. And then we'll turn them both to auto and we'll see what that looks like, and then both to dynamic desirable and we'll see what that looks like. So these are only 3 of the actual variations that you can achieve with DTP, and there are a lot more to it. So as I said in the previous video, very highly recommended that you get some hands-on through either some sort of Cisco packet tracer or actually with physical equipment. And depending on the make and model, DTP tends to differ as in its default behavior. Sometimes it's dynamic desirable per port, sometimes it's dynamic auto. So let's dive in, let's go through some of the DTP examples and then go from there. Okay, so here we are, we're logged into 2 switches. We have switch 3 and 4, and they're connected on their gig 0/24 interface. And it's just a direct cable between the 2 devices. Before we get started, let's see whether switch 3 or 4 has any trunk ports. And we can do that by saying show us interface trunk. And since it comes back with nothing, it tells us that they've not formed a trunk with one another. So let's dive a bit more and try to find out why that is. First of all, let's look at the running config for the interface. And we can see that the interface has its default configuration, which means that it's in the no shut state, meaning the interface is up. But what we don't know by looking at this is the default DTP configuration. The way we can find that out, as previously mentioned in the last video, would be to look at the interface switch port. And to do that, we do show interface gig 0/24 with the keyword of switch port. And it comes up with all of the information that we need from actually understanding what's happening with this switch port. We can see that the switch port is enabled. So this tells us that it's a layer 2 port and not a layer 3 port. And most importantly, this is where most of our attention is going to be as far as DTP is concerned. We can see that the admin mode is dynamic auto. And remember, the admin mode is what's actually been set. So in this case, we can say that switch 3 has a default DTP configuration of dynamic auto and not dynamic desirable. And because the administrative mode is dynamic auto, that means that it's passively waiting for DTP messages. And if it receives a DTP message, then it will perform a trunk. And if it doesn't receive a DTP message, it won't form a trunk. Moving on, we can see the operational mode. Now the operational mode is static. So that tells us quite a few things. First of all, this is not what's been set, but what is the actual output of what's been set. So like I said, dynamic auto means it's been passive. And because it's passive, it's waiting for DTP. But because it hasn't received DTP, the output of the port has become static. If the other side of this switch was sending DTP messages, then I would expect the operational mode to become a trunk. So already we get to understand what the other side is actually set as. We know that the other side must be set to dynamic auto or to access because this side has not received any DTP messages. Now it might be set to trunk, but DTP may be manually turned off. But we know that these switches are in their default state, and by default a switch is not statically set into trunk with DTP turned off. So we can make a bold assumption, which we can verify in a moment, that both of these switches are running as dynamic auto. And we know from the previous video that if both switches are dynamic auto, they will not form a trunk because they're both passive and no one is actively trying to form it. So that's one already, before we get started, one of the 3 combinations answered from the slide. So let's go over to switch 4 before we move on. And we're just going to highlight this command, take it over, paste it in, save a bit of time. And we can also see that, just as we expected, it's auto by default, and because both sides are auto, the output of DTP is it does not form a trunk. So let's go ahead and on one of these switches, let's say switch 4 because we're here now, let's set it up as a static trunk. So the way we do that is we need to navigate to the interface configuration. So we're going to go into the global configuration, specify the interface we're interested in, and it shows us we're now in the config if state, which is the interface configuration. Now from here, depending on the make and model, we tend to do switchport mode trunk. But typing this in may do 2 things. One, if it's an older switch, it will ask for the encapsulation to begin with, because the switches doesn't know whether you want to run ISL, which is the Cisco Proprietary, or whether you want to run the .1Q, which is the open standard. Now on the newer switches, ISL is not supported, therefore putting the switchport mode trunk will be accepted. But because this is an older switch, it's probably going to moan at us when we try to type that in, because again it wants us to set the encapsulation. And rightly so. It says an interface whose trunk encapsulation is auto cannot be configured to trunk. So what we first need to do is specify the encapsulation. So we do switchport trunk encapsulation, and if we hit question mark, you can see we have a few options. We can do the .1Q, we can do the ISL, or we can negotiate. But in this case, we're just going to pop in the .1Q. And now, if we press up on the keyboard a few times to go back to the previous command, we can type it in without any problems. Now once the port flaps and comes back up, if we go back up a few more times and have a look at the output of the switch port, let's have a look what's changed. First of all, on this side, so we're still on switch 4, we can see that the administrative mode is changed to trunk. And that's right, because we have manually set it to trunk. But the output of that has determined the switch to become a trunk. So remember, this is the output, and this is what's been set. We can see here, it says negotiation of trunking is on. This means that DTP is on. Remember, in the previous video, I said the only way to turn off DTP is to turn off by saying no negotiate under the switch port or making it an access port. If you were to manually set it to a trunk like we have here, DTP messages are still sent to the neighbor. So let's go across back to switch 3 and let's see what we have. So again, it's still set to dynamic auto, which we said was the default for this switch's make and model. But we can see now the output isn't access, but the output is actually trunk. And that's because those DTP messages were sent in and this particular switch negotiated a trunk. If we do the command that we've done when we first got in, which was the show interface trunk, we can see that a trunk is now formed. We can see that it was negotiated, which is what that N represents. We can see it was using the .1Q encapsulation, because remember I set it to that on one side. It's trunking. all of the VLANs are allowed, and it tells you what VLANs are actually created locally and which VLANs are forwarding because of spanning tree. And just to clear something up before we move on, this N means that the encapsulation was actually negotiated, not so much the actual trunk itself. In fact, the trunk here, where it says mode is auto, this means our local mode was auto. And the output was it became trunking and it negotiated .1Q. Okay, so what we're going to do now is our last variation from the slide, which is for both sides of the switches to be set to the dynamic desirable state. So let's go ahead and get that done. And to make this a little bit quicker, we'll just bring up Notepad. Okay, so that's both sides done is dynamic desirable. Now let's have a look at the output. So we go on both switch 3 and 4. Let's have a quick look. So on switch 3, we can see the switch port mode is enabled. Administrator has set it to dynamic desirable, and we know that this is active, so it does send DTP messages. So as we would expect, both sides become a trunk. So let's go to the other side. Identical, once again, you can see dynamic desirable, the output is a trunk. So DTP is a very straightforward protocol. There's a few variations, but it's important that you understand what variations will successfully form a trunk and which variations will not form a trunk and is on by default and what it's trying to achieve. The other thing to keep in mind is it is considered a security concern in some areas. So if we have two switches that are connected together and we have a couple of devices that are connected sort of downstream, you would expect here to become a trunk, maybe via DTP or better still, statically setting on both sides. But depending on the make and model of the switch, it may send out DTP messages downstream or it may not, but it will be in a state where most likely if a client was to send DTP messages through some malicious software, there's a good chance that this link between the client and the switch will become a trunk. So you need to make sure that these ports are either shut down if they're not being used, or they're in the access, so DTP is turned off. Don't try to leave a bunch of ports in their default state, because remember, the default state is no shut, which means the ports are enabled. The default state is to wanting to perform a trunk, whether that's active or passive, so you open yourself up to potential attackers. Okay, so moving on to CDP and LLDP. So first of all, CDP stands for the Cisco Discovery Protocol, and LLDP stands for the Link Layer Discovery Protocol. Notice that the LLDP has an 802 number, which is given by the IEEE, so we know that this is open standard. And since CDP has the word Cisco in it, you can make an assumption that this is a proprietary protocol. So let's see the difference between these two protocols and what they're actually used for. So starting with CDP, as I said, it's Cisco Proprietary. What does CDP and LLDP actually do? Well, there's a layer 2 network discovery or neighbor discovery protocol, meaning if we go back to our switches, let's say we have a switching deployment and it has a bunch of switches configured throughout, and you want to know, let's say you're on this switch via SSH and CDP is turned on. You then look at the CDP neighbors, what will happen is this switch will actually identify that there's another Cisco switch connected upstream. It will tell you what port number, what's the IP address, what's the iOS version of the switch upstream. It essentially is able to discover the directly connected devices. And you can use this to actually map out the network. So if you're an admin and you logged into a device and CDP was enabled on the links between the devices, you would be able to map out the layer 2 network throughout and identify what devices are connected to where and what capabilities those devices have actually got. So from the switch, you'll be able to identify that this is a switch with layer 2 or layer 3 capabilities. So it's a handy protocol, but it's also one that opens up a ton of security concerns, as you can imagine. So as I said, it provides a bunch of information, including interface, IP addresses, and the OS version. Now moving on to LLDP. So this is our CDP up the top, the Cisco Discovery Protocol, and down here is our LLDP. So it's open standard, we know this. Because it's open standard, it can work between vendors. Now it's not always straightforward, and it certainly depends on the vendor, but it does have an open standard, and if both vendors support it, it can work between vendors. Now, unlike CDP, CDP is enabled on all ports by default. LLDP is disabled by default. Now remember, just a moment ago we talked about the security concerns around the default switch port configuration. Well, this is another concern. The port's in the no shut state. The port wants to become a trunk through DTP. The port is sending out CDP information. So these are the sort of things that's really important that we disable or we shut down ports that are not being used in our network. So the thing you need to remember with CDP and LLDP is the Cisco certification is going to be keen on making sure that you know the difference between them, the fact that one is proprietary and one is open standard, and it's going to test your knowledge on most likely small things like the timers. So I would recommend that you know that CDP are sent out every 60 seconds, and if a neighbor doesn't hear from the switch or device within 180 seconds, which is obviously 3 times the timer, 3 times the hello, it will consider the neighbor down and it will be removed from its CDP neighbors. Same is true with LLDP. They're sent out every 30 seconds and the hold down timer is 120 seconds. Now I've also got a comment down the bottom here that says CDP uses, and I've got this address. Hopefully by looking at that address, you're able to identify what address that is and what layer of the OSI model you would expect to see that. So that'd be at layer 2, which is the data link layer, and this is a MAC address. And essentially CDP will use this MAC address, but this MAC address is also used for a bunch of other protocols, some of which that are not included in the CCENT and CCNA, some of which are. So DTP, we talked about that. Well, DTP messages are sent using the same well-known MAC address. And inside that, we've also got VTP, the port aggregation control protocol, and UDLD, the unidirectional link detection. Now, how about configuration? CDP and LLDP are configured similar, but kind of different commands. To configure CDP, under the global process, we simply pop CDP run, and that turns on CDP on all ports. And again, that's normally a default state. We can set a timers for CDP. Remember, we've got these defaults already set up, and we can change the hold timer. We can turn it off globally, or we can turn it off per interface. So a good practice with CDP is if you do want to utilize it, make sure that you're only running CDP between trusted devices. If you have a link on a switch or a device going to another vendor or supplier, turn off CDP. They don't need the noise on the link, and you're giving information away about your network. information that you particularly don't want to give away. If both sides are actually running CDP, you can look at the neighbors, and this will give you a brief summary of what port and what devices are on each port. And then you can look at each neighbor in more detail, and this will give you maybe the iOS and the IP addressing and detail per interfaces. You can check the timers using the show CDP or information about a particular CDP entry. LLDP, similar again, you can configure it to run globally, but to turn it off on a per interface, you have to use the null LLDP transmit to not send LLDP, and the no LLDP receive to not accept LLDP. So again, a little bit different to the config that's done up here, and something that you may want to keep in mind is part of the CCENT exam. And then verifying is also very similar. You would do the show LLDP interfaces to look at the interfaces, and neighbors, look at the neighbors detail, and then query a particular entry to find out more information about that neighbor. So briefly, let's go back to our switches and start off by querying the CDP. So these switches are in the default state, so I'd expect they're able to identify with other switches that I've got configured inside this network. Now we're only working on 3 and 4, but there are essentially a couple of switches as part of this lab. We can see that there are actually, switch 4 has 2 links to switch 2. It's local gig 19 and it's local gig 20, both go to switch 2. You can see the hold down timer of CDP. So remember, this will decrement, and then every 60 seconds you would expect this to be refreshed. It tells you the capabilities of the remote device. So here it says the capability is S and the capability is I. And if we look up the top at the table, it gives us an understanding of what that actually means. So the switch, or the device I should say, at the other end of this supports IGMP, and it has switching capabilities. So we can tell that it's a switch. We know what platform it is. We know it's a 3560E, and what port on their side we're plugged into. The same is true with the entry at the bottom. We can see that there are 2 ports between switch 3 and locally switch 4. The local switch 4 ports are here. The remote switch 3 ports are here. What if we add the detail on the end of it? We can see a lot more of information about our neighbors. So we know that switch 2 is a neighbor. Well, now we can see a lot more about the actual platform. We knew previously it was a 3560E, but now we know it's a 48 port version. We can see what iOS it's running and what image, so it's the IP base image. We can see what native VLAN it's got. We can see what duplexing's been set. So there's a lot of information here that if you were pairing up with a third party, particularly, you may not want them to know about what iOS version you have, because then they could potentially find some vulnerability regarding that iOS and then attack you with it. If we're interested in just a particular neighbor, we can say the show CDP Neighbors question mark it, and then we can pop it on a particular interface. Let's say 19, and then we can hit the detail to just filter out it. So you can see that only this comes back by default, because as you can imagine, this switch has 48 ports. If it connects to 48 devices that supported CDP, there'd be a lot of information, so make sure you know how to filter it down. Okay, so what about LLDP? Let's go ahead and type in the show LLDP Neighbors, and it comes back telling us LLDP is not enabled. So let's go into config T and get the LLDP enabled, And now I would expect to see no neighbors because it's off by default on all the other switches. So what we're going to do is jump across to switch 4 and enable LLDP on this side. And now what started to happen is the interval of LLDP packets will be sent out, and once those packets have been sent and received on both sides, they will form the neighbors, and then essentially it will show in the neighbor table. So you can see at the moment they've not formed they've not discovered each other essentially. So let's give it a few more moments, and then eventually when we click it, oh, there you go, it's actually got 2 entries. So just like CDP, you're looking at the same information. Kind of what's different here is obviously the hold down time is different because we've got different timers for LLDP, and the capability is shown a little bit different. So here the capability shows itself as B, but just like before, we've got this table at the top that gives us an output of what the table actually means. And in this case, they use the terminology of bridge instead of switch. So what about the details? Well, to do that, we do the show LLDP neighbor, and then we use the details command. And in this case, it's going to come back with a bunch of details about the neighbors. In this case, our only neighbor, which is switch 3. So we know it's switch 3 because I've put switch 3 as the host name on the other side. We can see what ports and the base MAC address. We can see any information relating to the iOS and what capabilities. So before we said that the B represents that it's a switch-in capability. The R means that it actually can do routing because this switch can be actually layer 3 as in switch 3, but only has the layer 2 capabilities enabled. We can also see what physical media capabilities or what Ethernet standard is actually supported. So we can see, for example, 10 base T, which is 10 meg over twisted pair, is supported, or even 1000 base T, which is 1 gig over twisted pair. VLAN IDs, and a lot more information. But ultimately, CDP and LLDP are achieving the same goal. They're finding neighbors on the links, they're querying those neighbors, and giving you information to help with network discovery. You need to make sure you know the difference between CDP and LLDP and how to configure and verify both of the protocols. Okay, so that's all we've got time for in this lesson. Just to review what we talked about, we first of all went over DTP, the Dynamic Trunking Protocol. In the last video, we touched base on the theory and why DTP is actually used, and in this video we got 3 types of different DTP configurations, and we started to configure them. We've seen how to verify DTP using the show interface gig 0/24 switch port, with the switch port being the keyword there to use on the end of the command to show you the information relating to that switch port. And we went through enabling auto at both sides and noticing the output was access, and auto trunk and noticing it actually formed a trunk, and then verifying that trunk in itself. We then jumped into 2 new topics, which was CDP and LLDP. We said CDP was a Cisco Proprietary protocol, LLDP was open standard. They achieved the same thing, which was to help engineers map out the network if they didn't have any topology, but at the same time it comes with some pips because we didn't want any opening up some security concerns actually connecting to third parties or other vendors. So we wanted to make sure that our discovery protocols are actually disabled on a per port basis pointing towards them, or better yet, globally disabled. We said that we need to make sure that we know the difference between CDP and LLDP. Even though they achieve the same thing, they're configured differently and the verifications are very similar but can be different. So have a little look at that, make sure you're familiar with it. Now DTP and CDP are much older protocols, So you're going to find that most Cisco switches actually support CDP and DTP, so make sure you get your hands on experience with that. LLDP is a little bit newer, so if you want to play with LLDP, then go on the Cisco Feature Navigator and make sure that the iOS you've got on the device supports that feature. Other than that, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and I hope this has been informative, and if it has been, please do like and subscribe.